What's up guys, my name's Liam and today we're going to be talking about the long-awaited Zowie ZA13-C. I've actually been getting a lot of requests about this mouse. A lot of people have been mostly wanting me to compare this mouse to other offerings on the market. So is this going to be the perfect mouse for you? And more importantly, what else does it compare to? Let's check it out. Alright guys, and here we got the Zowie ZA13-C. Here's what the box looks like, and inside the box, what you're going to be getting. When you open it up here, as you can see, you got the mouse. And then what's included is basically just an extra set of skates. And I will tell you guys, I'm not really that much of a fan of these skates, but you know, it is a cool idea that they go and throw that in there. Also got a Zowie sticker, and then looks like there's just some documentation there. And when it comes to the actual mouse itself, here as you can tell, I've been using this thing quite a bit. It's a fingerprint magnet. So it gets very oily, very dirty looking, and yeah, you definitely notice it. Just after even a little bit of use, the fingerprints start to accumulate on here. These are not some of the worst feet that I've ever used, but I'm definitely not a fan of them. They, by no means, in my opinion, feel premium. I definitely feel like if this was the mouse for me and I would have made it and used it, probably the first thing I would do is I'd swap out the feet. They don't have the worst gliding experience ever, but again, I just do feel like they're kind of behind, and they're definitely not on par with some of the other premium offerings on the market. I love how there's literally, on my copy, there's literally no side play almost on the left and right button. A lot of that could be because of the design. It does have this shell that kind of sticks out here. And the next thing that I actually really like about this mouse is the click on the scroll wheel button. Let's do a little sound test here. I do feel like the click on the scroll wheel button, I do feel like it's really easy to spam. I don't feel like it's too heavy. I feel like honestly it's just right. And another thing I do like about this mouse, I do like the switches. I do feel like they're really light. I do feel like they're easy to spam. So let's go and drop a sound test on the switches. Overall, this mouse is pretty great to use. They've done a pretty good job with the basic functions of the mouse for the most part. So let's go ahead and get into some of the things on where I kind of found issues with this mouse. The click implementation it's okay. You know, there's quite a bit of pre-travel on here. As you can see there, I get quite a bit of pre-travel, mostly on the right click as opposed to the left click, but quite a bit of pre-travel. And then the post-travel, again, you know, same thing with this and the Vaxi mouse. I just kind of feel like it just kind of smacks into the base of the mouse there. Kind of overall plasticky, you know, it's kind of like an old style type of a feeling to me. I feel like the buttons, even though there's no side play on them, probably because of the design, they just feel really loose to me. And let me show you a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Believe it or not, I actually had a lot of issues with this mouse. You know, if I was getting rough with it or like in a bind and kind of slamming the mouse around, I kept hitting the switches like constantly. Now check this out. Like you can, and look, I'm not even gonna push on the bottom of the mouse. You can actuate the switches all the way from back here. It's just really like flexible to me, in my opinion. And again, even when I had the mouse down, you can see just like pushing your hand down on top of the mouse. It doesn't just activate one button, it activates both of them. Like, look, I'll just put my wrist down and I can just, look at that, easily actuate it. Like, it's really easy. So that's kind of shocking to me. Another thing is, you know, the bottom is obviously flexible, but I don't usually get in that too much. Most mice don't even really have a bottom anymore. They're all cut out. But when it comes to the side of the mouse, just like with the Vaxi mouse, and I know they're not the same company, they split apart, but man, just look how easy the flex is on this. And I'm talking there's one time where I was swiping in game and just the side buttons, and it's not even just one of them, it's both of them. So getting some extreme flex here on the shell. And typically I'm not a type of a person that, you know, ever gets too rough with my mouse or squeezes too hard, but in this case, you know, honestly, I feel like this is one of the softest and most flexible shells out of any mouse that I've ever had. But at the same time, you know, I've just always had these types of issues with the Zowie and the Vaxi mice, even though everybody claims that they're god tier build quality. When it comes to the side buttons, so the front side button isn't that bad for me. There is quite a bit of play on it, but it's not terrible. But I do have really terrible play here on the rear button. And look at all that play right there. It's actually pretty nuts. So you got to go in quite a ways before it even actuates. Good news is, however, is once you do actuate the switch, you know, it doesn't feel like it's going to fall in the shell or anything like that. You do hit a pretty solid stop right there. Just overall, the rear side button on my copy feels extremely mushy. And then the final thing I'd like to talk about is the scroll wheel. Let's go and drop a sound test on the scroll wheel really quick. I do want to say that the steps they're honestly, they're extreme. They're kind of a little too much for me. You know, some people that might be a good thing. However, I just feel like, you know, if you're somebody that utilizes the scroll wheel a lot like I do, you know, jumping it wasn't an issue, but when you're trying to spam forward movements with the tap strafing and stuff like that, it's not as easy to spam. I actually really like this mouse. It did grow on me quite a bit. I honestly am excited to pick up the wireless version of this mouse when it comes out, if it ever does come out. And I'd also like to try out the S2 as well. All right, so now let's get into the shape. So a lot of people talk about this shape, and I've heard many reviewers say that this is the absolute god tier shape. Talk about how it has an extremely high profile to give you stability. The sides are pretty narrow and it has a very low front end. And I do want to say that when I did get this mouse out of the box, you know, I wasn't a fan of it right away. As a matter of fact, I just really didn't like it. And the reason is because the profile is like extremely high on there. This hump is higher than just about anything out there on the market. Kind of had to do a relaxed claw, just kind of sit further back on it for my grip style. And, you know, honestly ended up working out for me. So though personally it's not my favorite shape out there, I definitely did enjoy it. I did like it. Again, once I got used to it, I did feel like it did absolutely bring a unique experience. On my scale, it looks like I'm getting just about 68 grams there for it. All right, so let's go and run it down the list and we'll compare it to most of the rear hump mouse offerings out there on the market. So the first mouse I'm gonna bust out here is the Lamzu Atlantis Mini. Definitely has a much less aggressive hump towards the rear. It feels a bit wider in hands. So when you throw them up on the side profiling here, the hump is much higher on this one. The side profiling, you could tell that the Lamzu Atlantis Mini the curves are much more aggressive on this mouse, and you can overall see it's just much wider, especially here towards the rear of the mouse. Another thing I'd like to note too about the Lamzu mice is they're more narrow here at the bottom and they get wider as they come to the top. So that's kind of another reason why I do like these mouse so much, and how I'm able to, once I get a good grip on it, it just kind of sucks to your hands. Whereas the ZA13-C just kind of has an old school style where it just tapers off and then falls down to the bottom of the mouse. And then as you can see here on the rear of the mouse, the Lamzu Atlantis Mini has a much less aggressive tapering from the middle of the mouse to the sides, whereas this one tapers off quickly, making the overall mouse just feel more narrow in your hands when you're gripping it with a claw grip or with a palm grip. Alright, and then next up we have the OG Atlantis. The hump definitely feels much wider on the Lamzu OG over this thing, whereas the hump on the Zowie feels higher and definitely more aggressive. So overall in hands, the OG Atlantis feels way wider than this mouse. Especially if you're doing like a relaxed claw or palm grip on it, you can see how narrow that my hands get right here, whereas this one, my hand basically is able to grip the Lamzu flat. So overall, the Atlantis OG definitely feels much bigger in hands. It feels much wider. It fills up your hands a lot more. And it definitely doesn't have as aggressive as a rear hump as far as the height goes. Alright, and next up I figured I'd throw the Logitech GPRO Superlight in here. Although the Logitech GPRO Superlight is not a rear hump mouse, it does have a higher middle hump profile, so I figured I'd put them next to each other to check it out. Alright, I definitely want to say that off the bat, the GPRO Superlight definitely feels like a bigger mouse in hands. It has a much wider feeling. The curves are flatter feeling than the ZA13. And then when it comes to the height of these mouse, you can see you're going to feel more of the height right here on the GPRO Superlight. Whereas on the ZA13-C, you're going to feel it more in the back here. So if you look at these mice next to each other, this tapers off more slowly from the top of the mouse to the sides than this one. So overall in your hands, when you're laying your palm or your claw grip down over the top of this mouse, it definitely overall just has a much more narrow feeling than the GPRO Superlight. The top of the Logitech GPRO Superlight, it makes more contact from the front to the back of your hand if you're doing some type of a claw or palm grip with this mouse. Whereas with the ZA13, you really just mostly get one main point of contact area right here if you're doing just like a relaxed claw on it. I mean, even if you're doing a palm on this mouse, it just mostly is just going to make contact with this area right here. I do kind of prefer the ZA13-C over the G PRO Superlight, just because I've kind of favored rear hump mice, and even though it does have this aggressive rear hump here in the back, I do feel like it has an extremely low front end. It curves down sooner, and overall just doesn't have the slow profile from front to back as the Logitech G PRO Superlight has. And then when it comes to the weight of these mice, you can definitely tell a difference. This definitely feels like you get much free range of motion with it being wireless, and it does feel lighter as well. Not as big of a difference as on the Lamzu mice, but you can definitely tell it's there. All right, and next we got the XM2we. Now, as you can see in the hands, the first thing I noticed about the XM2we is this mouse definitely feels much wider than the ZA13-C. I do feel like the curve profile on the bottom of these mice is pretty similar. As you can tell, it's a little bit more aggressive here on the XM2we, but overall they do have a slight curve. It's nothing too extreme, and it's nothing that's too flat. Where you're gonna get the biggest difference here is it's kind of similar to the Lamzu, though this isn't as wide feeling as the Lamzu mice in the palm of your hand. Or if you're doing some type of a claw, you can definitely see that the curve profile from the top middle of the mouse to the sides is much more narrow on the ZA13-C, whereas this overall is a lot wider. I definitely feel like you can fingertip grip both of these mice, but you know, overall I just kind of like the feeling of the ZA13-C for fingertip grip personally. And I must say that obviously that the ZA13-C does have a cable and is a little bit heavier. The difference in the feeling of weight between these two isn't a big difference. You can definitely tell obviously this gives you a free range of motion and it feels a bit lighter. But I do have to say that out of all the mice on the list, this is kind of up there with one of the heavier feeling types of mice for me. And as you can clearly see when it comes to the top hump profile, this is nowhere near as aggressive as the ZA13-C. Cooler Master MM712, MM711, all the older versions of this mouse. And when it comes to the rear hump profile, I mean, the ZA13-C, again, it's just on a whole nother level. It's like nothing I've ever experienced before. It is definitely much higher, but as you can see here towards the rear of the mouse, they do have a very aggressive tapering from the hump to the rear of the mouse. So when you got these mice in hands, you can clearly tell the difference that this has a much pointier, higher hump on it, as where this definitely has a very slow, less aggressive curve from the top middle of the hump to the sides. So overall, the MM712 feels wider in hands, especially if you do make contact with your hand, your palm underneath your knuckles, in any type of way on top of the shell, but it definitely doesn't come up to a point as much and taper off as aggressively, or does it go as high. And you can obviously tell that the MM712 is much shorter. You can definitely tell that it definitely does feel a bit wider. But the curve profile on it, as you can see, this one, the MM712 definitely has more of a unique curve profile where it curves more up towards the front of the mouse, but the curving on the sides are not very aggressive. Alright, and next up we have the X2 Mini, and as you can tell off the bat here, the X2 Mini definitely feels like a wider mouse. The X2 definitely has way flatter sides on it, but when it does come to the rear hump and the curvature profile on it, the ZA13-C is still slightly a bit more aggressive. However, the X2 Mini does have one of the most aggressive curves when it comes to the top middle of the mouse to the sides. You can see it is definitely a much lower feeling mouse. As far as the height of the hump goes, you can see this one is definitely much higher than it. When it comes to the overall thickness of these two mice, when you do look at the overall flare, yeah, the ZA13-C is much more narrow in the middle, but once it flares out towards the front and to the back, you know, honestly, the back of this mouse and the front of this mouse, they feel pretty similar in width to the X2 Mini. So when it comes to the comparison of these two, when it comes to the actual width and grip of the mouse, honestly, these two would be very similar. Now, it does make a lot more of a difference where the Cooler Master is closer, I would say, with the hump. I would say that when Pulsar actually does release their version of the X2 Mini, and if they do release it with the higher hump on it, I would say that this would absolutely be the closest competitor to the ZA13-C. But just with how flat the hump feels right now, again, it does feel aggressive, but it definitely feels much lower than the ZA13. It kind of sets them apart. But again, the overall width and feeling of the mice, you know, if the X2 Mini had more curves to it, they would honestly be incredibly similar to one another. All right, and then next up we have the X2 Medium, and the X2 Medium starts to get closer to the actual hump. Again, it's not nearly as high, so when they do come out the higher hump version, it's definitely going to be much closer. As you can tell, the curvature from the top middle to the side profiling on the ZA13 is much more aggressive, whereas on the X2 it is a little bit less aggressive. But overall, I would say that these mice aren't too far apart. I would absolutely say the ZA13-C is a closer version to the X2 Mini as compared to the X2, just because of how much wider this mouse feels to the ZA13-C. And though these aren't nearly the exact same, or not even close to being a 1-for-1, honestly these do get pretty close when it comes to comparing it to the ZA13-C. And then the final mouse I'd like to bring up here is going to be the Ninjutso Sora. You know, overall the Ninjutso Sora does feel like a bit of a wider mouse when it comes to ZA13-C, but as you can see, the side curve profile here on these mice, being the most narrow in the center, slightly flaring out towards the front and rear of the mice, they're very similar. Again, if the Ninjutso Sora was just a bit more narrow, I feel like these mouse would feel a lot more similar. And then when it comes to the actual rear hump profile, as you can see, obviously definitely much higher there on the ZA13-C over the Sora, but the Sora does have a pretty aggressive rear hump. And though it might not be as tall or might not taper off as aggressively towards the sides, and if you look here closely, they kind of do have this almost a similar low profile. The ZA13-C might be a little lower towards the front, but I definitely feel like the Sora is much lower to the front. I definitely feel like it has that aggressive taper off towards the rear of the hump. And as you can see here, stacking them on top of one another, they actually look fairly similar to one another. Overall, these two are really close. It's just, it doesn't have as high of a hump. It doesn't taper off as aggressively to the sides, and it just feels a little bit wider in the hands. In my opinion, if I had to just create a quick tier list out of all the mice I compared it to today, I would say that even though these aren't clones or they're not the exact same thing, they are kind of still far off in certain areas, again, as far as height and stuff like that. I would say probably out of this collection, in my opinion, the closest feeling out of these mice is probably going to be, I'd probably say the Ninjutso Sora is probably one of the closest. You know, honestly, the X2 Mini is pretty close. It just has a much lower hump than on the Sora does, so the Sora has a higher hump, so it gives you almost a closer feeling to the ZA13-C. And though the overall width is closer to the ZA13-C on the X2 Mini, you know, I honestly probably would put it as a tier list. I'd probably put the Sora's probably the closest in my opinion, just overall. A really close second, I would say, be the X2 Mini. And then next, even though this mouse is much wider, the Cooler Master MM712, it definitely has some similarities in hands, besides being a lot wider, and definitely the widest out of all these mice. All right, guys, so that wraps things up for the final thoughts here on the Zowie ZA13-C. Again, I'm really excited to see what the future offers. I am going to be excited to pick this mouse up when it gets to be wireless. I am excited that Pulsar is coming out with higher rear hump mice that could honestly be pretty close to this. And I'm going to tell you guys right now, in hands, the X2 Mini feels really similar to this mouse as far as the width goes. Again, if it had a little bit more curvature towards the side, honestly, they'd be about spot on. So I'll be curious to see that when Pulsar does come out with the X2 Mini with a higher hump, if they were to keep all the other dynamics of the X2 Mini the same and just rise up the hump a bit more, you know, honestly, it's going to be pretty close to this one. And if you guys have any more questions or you feel like there's anything I left out, please let me know down in the comments below. And aside from that, if you're interested in seeing more videos like this in the future, please subscribe to my channel. I have left links down in the description below if you're looking to picking up any of these mice and supporting the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.